This section is all about writing down the syntax of propositional logic. Now, what does syntax mean? Well, it's all the symbols that you're going to use and all the rules that you're going to use to combine them in ways that are meaningful, in ways that you can actually use. So syntax is something that we use in computer science, that you use in propositional logic, that you would use in math. It's even something that you would use in grammar of normal language. But what you should note about this is that it's totally unhelpful for understanding what it is that we're doing. It's not that anybody picks up the syntax written, the written down syntax of propositional logic and is all of a sudden like, whoa, I can do propositional logic now. And if that's the case, why would we even do this in the first place? I've got a few reasons for you. The first one is going to be the weakest, which is that if you take another logic course, then almost assuredly they're going to talk about syntax. So I need you to understand it so you'll do well in those other classes as well. So I'll explain it to you the best I can here. But really, and here's I think one of the best reasons, is it's kind of like reference rules. So I have taught Spanish, and when I teach Spanish, the hardest thing in Spanish for English speakers is conjugation and changing of the verbs based on the subjects, based on who's doing the action. And almost invariably, I have students ask me, Senor Jones, which is what they call me, Senor Jones, do Spanish speakers do this like in their heads while they're talking to each other? Do they go, this is a third person singular. What is it? O, as, el habla. No Spanish speaker ever does that. In fact, they probably wouldn't even know that you could do that unless they took Spanish themselves. And really, once you learn Spanish, you're not going to be doing that either. However, you do get to these little hang-ups where you're trying to speak well, and you're all of a sudden like, but wait, what ending would this be, right? Like, two things sound kind of right. Which one should I use? And then you can remember these rules. Oh, well, this is a singular. It's not a yo or a two, so it's got to be one of the bottom one, right? In the same way, these will be like reference rules for us, where later on you're doing logic, you're like, wait, is that right? And then you can look back at the syntax and see if that's right or not. Good thing for you, this will be already written down. You won't have to memorize it, which is something you have to do when you're speaking Spanish out loud. Another reason for us to do this is that there are actually a number of different logics, and the syntax is what distinguishes them. And what do I mean? Well, there are some logics, as we saw in the last video, that some people that use different symbols to do propositional logic. No big deal. If we have our syntax, we'll know which ones we should use. But there are also different kinds of logic. If you continue on, you might be doing modal logic and having to worry about possible worlds. If you go into non-classical logics, you could learn fuzzy logic and I don't know, you could do all kinds of crazy stuff. The syntax is going to tell you the rules that you use in that logic. And of course, what symbols you're going to be using. So the syntax will be important for defining this is what we're doing in this logic. And finally, it's kind of cool. And I know you're going to say, what, syntax is cool? What? No, not super cool, I guess, but I don't know, it's kind of cool. Like you could do an infinite number of things with logic. You can, have an unlimited number of propositions. You can make sentences that are of no theoretical end to their length. And yet we can describe how that all happens on half a sheet of paper. Kind of cool. I don't know. So let's get into it. What is the syntax of propositional logic? Well, first we're going to list out the symbols that we're going to use in propositional logic, and we'll have three different kinds of symbols that we're using. First, the symbols for basic propositions. Remember what we said? We're going to be using capital letters of the English alphabet. So A, B, C, all the way through Z. And remember, that's only 26 letters, so we could need more, possibly. If we do need more, then we could just use subscripts. So there's no real limit to the number of subscripts you could put on there. You can go to infinity on any one of the letters. So we now have 26 infinities of letters. I know if you are a mathematician, I've done philosophy of math, so don't comment on my infinity knowledge. In fact, you can go check out my Philosurfer channel, and I talk about infinity. Fascinating subject. Anyway, back to this subject. Another kind of symbol we're going to be using are the symbols for connectives. So, those that we've listed out here, these are the things that we're adding to our basic propositions to change them into complex propositions. And finally, the punctuation. And all we're going to use for punctuation on these are going to be parentheses. The parentheses are going to be kind of like periods are in English. There are, definite times when you have to use them and you don't use them otherwise. Sometimes commas are a matter of style, like the Oxford comma. No, these parentheses are going to be mandatory, got to use them, and we'll talk about when we use them coming up here probably in the next video, in the well-formed formula video. But they're just like periods and other punctuation. They're going to be useful in keeping it straight what goes with what. Is it if both P and Q, then W? Or is it P and if Q, then W? And again, I'm using my hands and I'm going the wrong way. So it's P, then W, I don't know. Anyway, those are all the symbols we're going to be using. Now for the rules on how to combine those symbols. This is how we're going to make well-formed formulas in propositional logic. What is a well-formed formula? I'm going to save that for the next video to explain it, but just for right now, all you need to know is that a well-formed formula is the only thing we can use in propositional logic. It's the only thing that will make sense. Anything that's not a well-formed formula will be senseless in our language of propositional logic. So first of all, any basic proposition is a well-formed formula. An A, a B, by itself, right? That is a well-formed formula. A second rule, if alpha and beta are well-formed formulas, then the following are also well-formed formulas. And below there, we have the list of all the different connectives and basically how to use them. A couple of things, you might be looking at that alpha and beta and saying, what the heck is that, right? Those are Greek letters. We're using them to stand for well-formed formulas. For well-formed formulas that we already have. And then we plug them in here, those well-formed formulas, and we can create new well-formed formulas using these rules. Now, you may wonder, why not just use those A's and B's that we were looking at before, right? Well, remember, those stood for basic propositions. But not only that, these variables here, and really everything that we're doing right now, we're working in what's called a meta language. And what do I mean by that? Hopefully, hopefully this isn't too much vocabulary for you. But notice what we're not doing propositional logic right now. We're talking about propositional logic right now. We're explaining how to use propositional logic, but we're not doing the propositional logic. So the symbols that we're going to be using in propositional logic, well, it'd be confusing if we also use them in our meta language, in the language we're using to talk about propositional logic. Propositional logic here, by the way, is what philosophers will call the object language. It's the language that we are talking about. It's the object of our study, right? The meta language is, the language that's above the object of study. And it's possible sometimes to do, object language is the meta language. Like when you're talking about English and you're also talking about it in English. But for us, and what we're doing right now, it would be, we don't know how to use propositional logic just yet. So we can't do propositional logic while also talking about it. These variables then are called meta variables, and we're using them to let ourselves know, hey, we're not doing propositional logic right here, right? These are variables in our meta language, and it's not variables that we use while we're actually doing the logic that we're going to be doing. Something else that's important to note about these variables is notice that you can reuse these rules over and over again. This is what's called a recursive or an inductive definition. What does that mean? I'll talk about that in 2 videos from now. But for right now, all you need to know is that these rules can be used over and over again to generate more and more well-formed formulas or formulae. Either one of them I think is acceptable. I don't know, don't bust me on that. So let's see an example of using these rules. I could say, I know that A is a well-formed formula. Why? Because by rule 1, right, any basic proposition is a well-formed formula. So A is 1, right? And then I look at rule 2, and let's just do the first one there. It says not alpha. If alpha is a well-formed formula, then not alpha is also a well-formed formula. I know A is a well-formed formula, so I'll let alpha stand for A in this one. Well, that would mean not alpha, not A is also a well-formed formula. Sweet, I got a new one. Now let's look at the next one. It says in those parentheses, right, alpha and beta. Well, I just found out that not A is a well-formed formula, right? And my rule says that if alpha and beta are well-formed formulas, then this alpha and beta is a well-formed formula. Now I'm going to let alpha stand for not A. Notice you can do that. In reapplying these rules, alpha can stand for any well-formed formula. But I know not A is a well-formed formula, so I'll say not A, and then for beta, I'll let beta stand for A. Not A and A. Well-formed formula. New one. What about that next rule, alpha or beta? Again, I can form a new well-formed formula using that rule. I've got 3 new well-formed formulas that I could plug in here. What I'll do for this one, what I could do is I could let alpha stand for A, or what is it? Not A, and let beta stand for A. And that would make it not A and A, or A. But for the sake of edification, for the sake of our learning, here's what I'm going to do so you know something else you could do here. I'm going to let alpha stand for A, and I'm also going to let beta stand for A. Notice you can do that. Alpha just stands for some well-formed formula. Beta just stands for some well-formed formula. There's nothing that says that it can't be the same well-formed formula. So I get A or A, another well-formed formula. And of course, the same goes for the if-then and the if and only if. Now the last rule we have here is rule 3. Nothing else is a well-formed formula. Period. Given that rule, we've excluded anything that we don't have in these first 2 rules. So that's good. Our rules, our syntax, now list out all the symbols. It lists out rules on how to use these symbols, and it excludes anything else that isn't those rules. So we now have explicit rules on how to form well-formed formulas, how to form things that we can use in our language of propositional logic. The next question then is, what the heck are these things, right? And we're not going to get into it philosophically, what is a well-formed formula, but we will talk about exactly what is it mechanically. And for next time then, please do 2.5.1 exercises, just question 1. And in question 1, we will get some practice on what is and what is not a well-formed formula. And that will all be practice on using this syntax to make new well-formed formulas.